red truck, a red Tacoma truck. My husband bought it 2 weeks before my dad passed away. So it was about a month ago, less than a month ago, my husband bought this truck.
She was once the person Summer Wells trusted the most, yet soon became the name most fiercely suspected. Robin Lane, the Sabbath School teacher, the woman Summer clung to as her source of comfort, did not rush to the scene when the news broke. Instead, she stopped to gather snacks and flashlights. Before arriving later that night, affection turned into suspicion. Closeness became the very reason the community began to ask, was Robin simply a grieving witness? Or was she the hidden culprit behind one of the most shocking disappearances in Hawkins County? In every community tragedy, there is always one figure who seems to stand closer to the center of the storm than anyone else. In the disappearance of 5-year-old Summer Wells from Hawkins County, Tennessee, that figure was not only her parents, Candus and Don, but also an unexpected outsider, her Sabbath School teacher, Robin Lane. Robin was not a family member. She did not live in the Wells household or play a daily role in Summer's life. In the collective memory of those who knew the child, she emerged as one of the most important people Summer trusted. In fact, many who attended the Seventh-day Adventist Church remember how strongly the little girl gravitated toward Robin. That bond, so affectionate, so visibly deep, would later transform Robin from a grieving teacher into a name whispered with suspicion. Accounts from Robin and others in the congregation paint a vivid picture of Summer's attachment. Whenever she arrived at church, the 5-year-old would often climb the steps up to the platform where Robin was leading class or music. It was not a shy approach, it was instinctive, as if Robin represented safety and comfort. Summer loved physical closeness, often wrapping her arms around Robin, leaning against her, and seeking what Robin herself described as snuggles. In interviews after Summer's disappearance, Robin repeated those words. "I loved snuggles. She was like another daughter." For Robin, this was not a casual comment. It conveyed the depth of her affection, the way she viewed Summer as more than just another child in the congregation. She was special. She mattered. That level of intimacy was rare. Most children, even in nurturing church environments, show affection but with boundaries. For Summer, the boundary seemed blurred. She treated Robin as though she were part of her family, and Robin appeared to embrace the role. This was precisely what made Robin such a memorable figure when people began reconstructing Summer's life and final days. But here lies the paradox. The very closeness that made Robin central in Summer's story would later become the reason she could not escape scrutiny. In missing child cases, investigators and the public alike often focus not only on family members, but on anyone who had unusual access or a special bond with the child. That is why babysitters, neighbors, coaches, and yes, teachers, are sometimes examined. Their proximity can represent either protective love or hidden opportunity. For Robin Lane, the question became unavoidable. Was her affection for Summer simply the tender bond of a dedicated teacher? Or did it represent something more complicated, something darker, as some speculated? The core dilemma surrounding Robin Lane lies in perception. Closeness to Summer made her testimony essential, but it also made her vulnerable to suspicion. Human beings often struggle with paradoxes. We want to believe in pure love between teacher and child. At the same time, history has conditioned us to ask, could that love mask something sinister? In Hawkins County, the question echoed. Was Robin Lane a devoted spiritual guide, or was she a hidden link in the unsolved puzzle of Summer Wells? What complicates this further is how Robin herself became an enduring presence in the aftermath. She organized prayer vigils, wrote songs dedicated to missing children, and continually invoked Summer's name. To some, that was proof of her unwavering compassion. To others, it looked like overexposure, an attempt to keep herself at the center of the narrative. Ultimately, Robin Lane embodies one of the most fascinating aspects of the Summer Wells case, how love and suspicion can blur until they become almost indistinguishable. The details are striking. A child climbing the church platform to hug her teacher, a woman who cherished those embraces so much she called the girl another daughter. It is the kind of intimacy that, in any other context, would be celebrated, but in the shadow of a disappearance, That intimacy became the very reason the world could not stop asking questions. Love turned into evidence. Proximity became possible motive. And so Robin Lane remains a paradox the teacher who gave Summer comfort, and the woman who cannot escape speculation. Was her love simply that love, or was it the missing piece no one wants to admit? Until Summer is found, the question lingers, unresolved, hovering like that empty chair in the classroom, a symbol of absence and suspicion all at once. When Summer Wells was first reported missing on June 15, 2021, panic spread like wildfire through her family and community. In those early moments, when every second felt like a lifetime, one of the first people Candus, Summer's mother, reached out to was Robin Lane. This detail alone speaks volumes about the bond between the Sabbath School teacher and the 5-year-old child. In a crisis, people instinctively call those they feel closest to those they trust implicitly, and Candus's choice showed that Robin occupied a place of unusual intimacy within the Wells family circle. According to Robin's own account, her phone rang several times that evening. Candus was frantic, FaceTiming her repeatedly, her voice choked with panic as she said that Summer was gone. These calls were not casual. They were desperate attempts by a mother to pull others into her terror, to demand immediate understanding, and, hopefully, help. The tone of her voice carried urgency, yet what happened next became one of the most dissected and controversial details in the entire case. Robin did not race to the Wells property the instant she received the call. Instead, she went home first. There, she made what she described as a series of practical decisions. She handed her own child over to her husband so she could be free to help. She gathered flashlights, reasoning that the search would take place in the woods and continue after dark. And, in a detail that would later ignite endless speculation, she packed snacks. She arrived on Ben Hill Road around 9 p.m., nearly 3 hours after the first alarm had been raised. For some, this sounded reasonable: a mother securing her child, a community member preparing for a long night of searching. But for others, the choice seemed indefensible. If Summer truly was, in Robin's own words, like another daughter, why was there not an immediate rush, a frantic sprint, a single-minded urgency to get to the scene? It is this hesitation, this pause, that has followed Robin ever since. On YouTube panels and in Facebook discussion groups, critics seized on her words. The flashlights could be explained. Darkness was falling. But snacks, to some, that sounded like something a parent packs for a camping trip or a night at a park, not for a child abduction. Commenters wrote things like, "Ooh thinks about granola bars when a 5-year-old is missing," and "This isn't a picnic." The idea that someone would stop to prepare food before heading to a search for a missing child seemed almost absurd to those hearing it. It became a soundbite, a shorthand for doubt. Anytime Robin's name surfaced, the snacks and flashlights detail came with it, like a brand stamped on her public image. This is what psychologists might call the availability heuristic in action. Out of everything Robin may have said about that night, this single odd detail, snacks, became the most memorable, and therefore the most damning. It did not matter that she later explained her thinking as simple preparation for a long, grueling night. In the minds of many, the choice spoke louder than her words. From a psychological standpoint, there are two major lenses through which her behavior has been interpreted. The first is denial, a well-documented phenomenon in crisis situations. Denial does not always look like disbelief. Sometimes it manifests as delay. A person behaving as if the situation is less severe than it is because their mind cannot yet process the full magnitude of the loss. By gathering supplies, Robin may have been unconsciously cushioning herself against panic. The ritual of preparation can provide a sense of control in a moment defined by chaos. In this reading, snacks are not proof of detachment, but a coping mechanism, a way to keep fear at bay through action, however mundane. The second interpretation is far less charitable. Critics argue that the decision reflected a lack of genuine urgency, even a coldness. If Summer was another daughter, why wasn't Robin's first instinct to drop everything? run out the door, and race to Ben Hill Road. Why was there even time to consider food at all? From this angle, her actions are seen as inconsistent with her professed affection. They suggest calculation where there should have been instinct, and that dissonance raises eyebrows. In the true crime world, where online sleuths analyze body language and parse every word, such contradictions are rarely forgiven. Robin's delay quickly became a point of contention not only in forums but in mainstream commentary about the case. Some painted her as overly calm, even suspicious. Others defended her, noting that hindsight magnifies small decisions that, at the time, may not have seemed unreasonable. What cannot be denied is that her description of her actions created fertile ground for speculation. In the absence of hard evidence, public attention often latches onto human behavior, especially behavior that seems off-script. And in a case already thick with uncertainty, Robin's snacks became symbolic of everything that seemed strange, inexplicable, or unsettling. Part of why this reaction was so fierce lies in Robin's position. She was not just another church member. She was the teacher Summer clung to, the adult the little girl ran to for comfort and affection. In her own telling, Summer called her "another mother." That closeness elevated expectations. People believed she should have responded not as a neighbor, but as family. When she did not, the disappointment morphed into suspicion. It is a paradox of proximity. The closer you are to the missing, the more closely your actions will be judged. Every hesitation becomes magnified, every choice interpreted as evidence of hidden motives. For Robin, this paradox meant that what might have been ordinary hesitation for anyone else became extraordinary in her case. It is worth remembering that in real time, none of us knows how we would react. Some people freeze. Others panic. Some over-prepare. Human beings do not always conform to the heroic script the public expects. Yet in high-profile disappearances, those scripts matter. Communities crave order in the face of chaos, and when someone breaks the expected pattern, they become the focus of scrutiny. Robin's story illustrates this cruel reality. What may have been nothing more than a mother securing her own child and bracing for a long night became the single most replayed and ridiculed moment in her account. It overshadowed her prayers, her tears, even her ongoing involvement in vigils and church support. The snacks became shorthand for suspicion. In the end, the question lingers: was Robin's delay an innocent misstep, a sign of denial in the face of unbearable news, or was it something more unsettling? The truth may never be fully known. What is clear is that her decision carved a permanent mark in the narrative of Summer Wells's disappearance. It reminds us of how quickly small details can grow into symbols, how a moment of hesitation can be replayed endlessly until it stands for something larger than itself. For some, Robin's actions are forgivable, a human stumble in the face of horror. For others, they remain a red flag that cannot be ignored. In that gap between interpretations lies the power of perception and the enduring mystery of how love, loss, and suspicion intertwine in the case of a missing child. In every mystery that captures the public imagination, there are moments when the absence of the missing becomes more tangible than their presence ever was. For Summer Wells, that absence was etched most vividly not in police reports or news broadcasts, but in a small Sabbath School classroom at the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Kingsport, Tennessee. It was here, in the room where Summer once sang songs, scribbled with crayons, and wrapped her arms around her teacher, Robin Lane, that the silence became unbearable. The chair Summer always used still stood in its place. At first, children avoided it without even being told. Week after week, no one dared to sit there. It was not a rule written on paper, nor something Robin instructed them to do. It was, instead, an unspoken pact, an invisible boundary the children themselves honored. The empty chair became a kind of forbidden space, as though sitting in it would betray Summer's memory, as though occupying it would mean admitting she was not coming back. The power of absence radiated through that seat, transforming a simple piece of furniture into something sacred, something untouchable. Robin later described how strange and heavy those moments felt. Each Sabbath morning, as the children filed into the classroom. Their chatter would soften near that chair. Their eyes would glance toward it, then away, as if acknowledging the void without daring to disturb it. One child once moved close, paused, then quietly slid into a different seat. The message was clear: that chair was still Summer's. Even if her small frame never returned to fill it, the space belonged to her. Pinned to the classroom board were still some of Summer's drawings. They were not masterpieces by any artistic standard, just the casual markings of a 5-year-old, colorful scribbles and stick figures, uneven lines and bright patches of crayon. But after her disappearance, they took on new meaning. Each stroke felt like a voice frozen in time, a reminder of her joy and presence. Teachers often take down old art to make room for new projects, but Robin could not bring herself to remove Summer's drawings. To strip them away would feel like erasing her, and so they remained, gathering dust, becoming relics of a child who had once brought light into that room. In interviews, Robin's voice cracked as she spoke about the chair and the artwork. She would pause, swallow hard, and fight back tears. At one point, she whispered words that lingered with everyone who heard them. "I believe she will come home. I have to believe." It was not simply a statement of hope but of survival. For Robin, believing was the only way to endure the weight of loss. To accept that Summer would never sit in that chair again was a burden too heavy to carry. Psychologists often talk about the power of symbols in grief. When someone is lost, the spaces they once occupied become charged with meaning. An empty chair at the dinner table, a coat hanging by the door, a child's drawing taped to a refrigerator, these ordinary objects become extraordinary. They stand as silent witnesses to absence, demanding acknowledgement. In the Sabbath School classroom, the empty chair became exactly that: a collective shrine, not built of flowers and candles, but of silence and avoidance. The children's refusal to sit in it mirrored what the adults in the community felt: that Summer was not just gone, she was still present, in a way that made her absence unbearable. This phenomenon is often called continuing bonds. Instead of severing ties with the lost, people maintain them through rituals, memories, and symbols. The empty chair allowed Summer's peers to maintain their bond with her without needing words. They did not articulate their grief in sentences. How could they, being so young? But their actions spoke volumes. The chair told a story. Summer still belonged, Summer was still remembered, and no one would replace her. For Robin, the classroom became a daily confrontation with both love and loss. Each lesson she tried to teach carried the weight of that silence. Where once Summer might have climbed onto her lap or run up to the platform for a hug, now there was only stillness. Robin described the atmosphere as if a shadow had settled over the room. The children sensed it. Parents sensed it. And Robin, standing in front of them, carried it most of all. The image of the empty chair spread beyond the classroom. Those who heard Robin describe it could visualize it instantly: a tiny chair, pushed up against a table, its surface bare, waiting. The mental picture resonated with people far outside Hawkins County. Online discussions picked it up as a symbol of the entire case. The chair represented not just Summer, but the countless children who go missing every year, leaving behind spaces that remain empty long after the world has moved on. It is telling that the community, in its collective grief, rallied around such imagery. Humans are wired to seek symbols, to find meaning in objects and places when words fail. For many, the empty chair was more powerful than any press release or news update. It captured the tragedy in a single, haunting image. Every time Robin said she still believed Summer would return, that chair became the physical embodiment of her faith. It was the waiting space, untouched, holding on to hope that one day a small body would climb back into it and restore the room's balance. But symbols also cut both ways. While for some the chair was a beacon of hope, for others it was a chilling reminder of the finality of loss. The longer Summer remained missing, the harder it became to believe that she would ever fill that space again. For Robin, keeping the chair empty was both a promise and a torment. It was an act of love, but also a daily reopening of the wound. Every Sabbath, she walked into that classroom and faced the absence anew. Every time she left the drawings on the board, she committed again to memory over closure. Sociologists studying collective trauma note how communities often crystallize their grief around shared symbols. In this case, the classroom was not just a private place of mourning for Robin and her students, it became a microcosm of Hawkins County itself. Just as no child would sit in Summer's chair, no community member could fully let go of her. The town held its breath, week after week, vigil after vigil, waiting for a resolution that never came. 3 years on, the chair still stands as an unspoken witness. It testifies not only to Summer's absence, but also to the persistence of memory, to the refusal of a community to move on without answers. Whether Summer returns or not, the chair has already become part of her legacy, a reminder of how deeply one small child touched those around her. Robin's tears, her whispered insistence that she must believe Summer will come home, encapsulate the fragile balance between hope and despair. The chair gives her something to hold on to, but it also anchors her in sorrow. That paradox is at the heart of the human response to loss. We need symbols to keep memory alive, but those same symbols keep the wound from healing. In the end, the empty chair is more than just furniture. It is a story told in silence, a story about a girl who is missing, about classmates too young to articulate grief, about a teacher caught between faith and heartbreak. It is a story about how communities mourn together, how they construct invisible rules to honor the missing, how they create sacred spaces out of ordinary objects, and perhaps most haunting of all, it is a story that refuses to close. As long as that chair remains empty, the question of Summer Wells's fate remains open. It sits there, week after week, like a symbol of unresolved mystery, carrying both hope and sorrow. The children still avoid it. The drawings are still pinned to the board, and Robin Lane still whispers the same fragile promise. I believe she will come home. I have to believe. But memory and mourning were not the only forces shaping the narrative. In the absence of answers, grief quickly collided with suspicion, and suspicion bred stories darker than the empty chair in a classroom. Attention shifted from the Wells family to the very institutions that surrounded them. For many online, the church was no longer just a place where Summer laughed and prayed. It became a symbol of secrecy, a backdrop onto which old fears and cultural anxieties could be projected. And in that atmosphere, Robin Lane was drawn into the crossfire of faith and conspiracy. The Seventh-day Adventist congregation in Hawkins County was not a large, sprawling megachurch. It was modest, tucked into the rural folds of Tennessee, the kind of place where families gathered for worship, song, and quiet reflection. For most, it represented stability, a shelter from the chaos of the world. But after Summer vanished, some corners of the internet began to paint it very differently. To them, the church was not just a place of faith, it was a place of secrets. YouTube videos and online forums began drawing parallels between Robin's church and infamous religious movements that ended in tragedy. Names like Warren Jeffs and his polygamist FLDS sect were invoked. Clips about Johnstown and Waco were spliced together with images of Hawkins County. The insinuation was clear. Perhaps what appeared to be a simple Adventist community was in fact something darker, something with hidden rituals and unspoken control. The comparisons were sensational, but they spread quickly. Warren Jeffs represented, in the American imagination, one of the darkest intersections of religion and exploitation. Jim Jones at Johnstown and David Koresh at Waco symbolized charismatic leadership gone mad, cloaking violence in theology. By linking Robin Lane's small congregation to those names, conspiracy theorists gave their suspicions immediate weight, even if the connections were tenuous at best. The suspicion was fueled further by statistics that circulated widely online: 17 unsolved murders or disappearances in Hawkins County since the 1970s. For some, this was coincidence, the tragic accumulation of decades in a rural region. For others, it was evidence that something was systematically hidden, that patterns of violence were being covered up by institutions, perhaps even by religious ones. Each unsolved case became another thread in a tapestry of fear, woven together with speculation and rumor. At the center of this cloud stood Robin Lane. She was not a preacher, not a cult leader, not a figure of institutional power. She was a teacher, a woman who ran Sabbath school classes, who sang songs with children, who wrote scripture verses on a board. But in the court of public opinion, nuance often dissolves. To skeptics, her closeness to Summer, her visibility in interviews, and her role in organizing vigils made her more than a grieving teacher. She became, in their imagination, a possible gatekeeper of hidden truths. Religion carries a double weight in cases like these. On one hand, it provides comfort, rituals of hope, and a language of faith that allows communities to endure the unbearable. Robin herself leaned on scripture, quoting verses about light and darkness, about faith in the unseen. But on the other hand, religion can trigger suspicion, especially when secrecy or hierarchy is perceived. People ask, what do they do behind closed doors? What traditions bind them together? What truths are withheld under the guise of faith? The online narratives about Robin and her church capitalized on this tension. Some YouTubers suggested that Summer's disappearance was linked to religious cover-ups, that the church might have harbored knowledge of what happened and chosen silence. Others pointed to the long list of unsolved cases in the county and asked if there was a pattern of spiritual institutions shielding their own. These theories had little grounding in evidence, but they had the power of storytelling. They were dramatic, cinematic, easy to consume, and they found audiences willing to believe. Robin's identity as a Seventh-day Adventist was often lost in the noise. For those spreading conspiracies, the distinction between Adventists and FLDS or apocalyptic sects hardly mattered. To them, religion itself became a shadow, a word that carried suspicion regardless of denomination. The mere mention of a church connection was enough to plant seeds of doubt. The irony was that Robin had no history of extremism. Seventh-day Adventists are a mainstream Protestant denomination, focused on health, Sabbath observance, and biblical teaching. They are far removed from the abuses of polygamist cults or doomsday groups. Yet perception is powerful, and once doubt takes hold, facts struggle to catch up. For many watching the case unfold online, Robin was no longer simply Robin the teacher, she was Robin the symbol, standing at the intersection of innocence and suspicion. In one of her interviews, Robin's own words highlighted this paradox. She spoke about how Summer would climb onto her lap during class, how she cherished the child's warmth and laughter. These are memories most would interpret as beautiful. But in the climate of conspiracy, such intimacy was reinterpreted as too close, unusual, even a red flag. The same gestures of affection that made Robin beloved in her community became, to outsiders, evidence of something hidden. It is not the first time religion has cast long shadows over missing person cases. History has shown that when answers are scarce, people turn to archetypes. Cults, churches, sects, they become narrative scaffolding for mystery. They provide a ready-made villain, a system of secrecy that feels plausible, even when unproven. And in rural Tennessee, with its layers of unsolved tragedy, that scaffolding was irresistible. Robin, for her part, tried to deflect the suspicion with transparency. She explained her role plainly. She was Summer's teacher. She loved her, she prayed for her, and she helped the family organize vigils. But the very visibility of those efforts reinforced the duality of her image. For every person who saw her as a beacon of hope, another saw her as a woman trying too hard, inserting herself into the center of attention. The heart of the issue lies not in Robin's actions, but in the way communities metabolize grief and uncertainty. When there are no answers, suspicion fills the void. Religion becomes both sanctuary and suspect. A teacher becomes both mourner and potential conspirator. And every unsolved case in the county becomes another ghost in the background, whispering that something larger may be at play. In truth, Robin Lane may simply be what she always was, a Sabbath school teacher, devastated by the loss of a child she considered like her own. But in the swirling narratives of Hawkins County, that role is not enough. People demand explanations. They demand villains. They demand hidden truths revealed. And so religion itself, the faith that Robin draws comfort from, becomes the shadow in which suspicion grows. The empty chair in Robin's classroom may symbolize Summer's absence, but in the wider imagination, the church itself became another empty chair, a space no one could sit in without feeling the weight of mystery. Whether fair or not, Robin Lane was caught inside that symbolism, her identity rewritten by whispers she could not silence. Suspicion rarely stays still. Once it attaches to one figure, it spreads outward, searching for others who might fit the shadows of doubt. In the mystery of Summer Wells, Robin Lane was not the only person whose name became entangled in theories. Two men, both connected to the Wells family and the church in different ways, also emerged as objects of speculation: David Dodson and Tim Mullins. Their presence in the story, and in Dodson's case, his sudden absence, became threads the public could not ignore. David Dodson was, by all accounts, a relatively new face at the Seventh-day Adventist Church, where Robin Lane taught. He had joined the congregation not long before Summer's disappearance. To some, his arrival was unremarkable, the kind of ordinary shift that happens in small-town churches all the time. Yet in the wake of tragedy, ordinary details were recast with suspicion. Dodson's background was what truly caught attention. By profession, he was tied to the funeral industry, working as an embalmer and with EMT services. In theory, such roles represent compassion and service, tending to the injured, the dead, and the grieving. But for the online true crime community, these same details cast an eerie shadow. To skeptics, someone who dealt with death professionally seemed like an unsettling figure to have floating near a missing child case. It was not evidence, but it was enough to raise eyebrows. What made matters worse in the eyes of critics was the timing. Not long after Summer went missing, David Dodson left the church altogether. In a community desperate for explanations, that exit was read not as coincidence but as flight. People began to ask, why would a man so newly involved suddenly disappear from the very congregation that had been at the center of the tragedy? To some, it looked like an attempt to distance himself. To others, it was simply bad optics, the kind of innocent decision that becomes damning under the weight of rumor. The combination of Dodson's background and his departure gave fuel to endless online threads. YouTubers dissected his career, his statements, his connections. They asked why a man who embalmed the dead, who had access to medical knowledge and facilities, would appear in the orbit of a missing child case and then vanish from view. None of these questions were backed by direct evidence. Yet absence and silence are often treated as admissions of guilt in the court of public opinion. If David Dodson represented the suspicious newcomer, Tim Mullins represented the enigmatic insider, the man behind the curtain. His role was less direct, less visible, but in some ways even more controversial. Mullins was a figure who appeared in the Wells world, not through Sabbath School, but through the strange machinery of media and communication. From the beginning, the Wells family seemed unusually entangled with online platforms and public messaging. Interviews were given, narratives were shaped, and outsiders began to whisper about who was guiding the family's hand. Tim Mullins' name often surfaced in those conversations. Some described him as a media advisor of sorts, a man with connections to both the family and the broader coverage of the case. To his defenders, this meant he was helping a struggling family navigate the brutal spotlight of national attention. To his critics, it meant something far more sinister: control. Rumors spread that Mullins was more than just a supportive acquaintance. Whispers suggested hidden ties, opaque motives, even manipulation of how the Wells family presented themselves to the world. Was he helping them seek justice, or was he managing their image to protect something or someone? As with Dodson, the lack of transparency became its own source of suspicion. In the true crime ecosystem, uncertainty is often enough to convict in the minds of strangers. What united both Dodson and Mullins was the way their names floated into the same storm that had engulfed Robin Lane. None of them were direct family members, yet all three were pulled into the gravitational field of suspicion simply because they were near Summer's life at critical moments. In small communities, proximity can be mistaken for complicity. And when tragedy strikes, people look for patterns, for villains that can explain the unexplainable. The gendered element was not lost on observers. While Robin was scrutinized for her warmth and closeness to Summer, affection that critics twisted into potential ulterior motives, Dodson and Mullins were judged through a different lens. Dodson was tied to death by his profession, Mullins to manipulation by his media ties. Together, they created a gallery of secondary suspects, not because of hard evidence, but because of the human tendency to fill silence with suspicion. In the weeks and months that followed, online forums spun entire theories around these men. Some painted Dodson as a man who had knowledge and means to hide evidence, his funeral work providing both skill and opportunity. Others depicted Mullins as a puppeteer, controlling narratives and shielding uncomfortable truths. None of it was proven. Yet repetition gave the theories power, and power gave them life. Meanwhile, the official investigation remained focused elsewhere. Law enforcement never named Dodson or Mullins as suspects. No charges were filed, no formal accusations made. To the authorities, they were simply names among many in a case defined by dead ends. But in the public's imagination, they became symbolic stand-ins for all the unanswered questions about who might have taken Summer, who might know more than they were saying. The suspicion cast on these men highlights a broader truth about the Summer Wells case. When a community is left without answers, the search for justice becomes inseparable from the search for someone to blame. Robin Lane, David Dodson, Tim Mullins, each of them became mirrors, reflecting the fears of a public desperate for closure. They were not merely individuals. They were archetypes: the grieving teacher, the newcomer with a dark profession, the shadowy advisor. Together, they represented the ripple effect of a single disappearance. One child vanished, and with her absence came a widening circle of doubt that touched not only family but friends, church members, and anyone who happened to stand too close. The lesson, if there is one, is that in the vacuum of truth, suspicion thrives. And in Hawkins County, that suspicion has never truly settled. Grief often seeks expression. For some, it comes in silence. For others, it comes in words, in action, in the attempt to turn despair into something constructive. For Robin Lane, the Sabbath School teacher at the heart of the Summer Wells story, grief became a public mission. After Summer's disappearance, she was not content to mourn privately. Instead, she stepped into a role that few in Hawkins County were prepared to take on: the role of a visible guardian of memory. Almost immediately after the initial search for Summer began, Robin helped organize vigils and prayer gatherings. These events brought neighbors, church members, and strangers together in quiet circles of candlelight, their flames flickering against the rural Tennessee darkness. In those moments, the missing child was not just a name on a flyer, but a spirit invoked in song and prayer. For many who attended, Robin became the face of hope. She spoke words of comfort, she prayed aloud, and she reminded everyone that Summer was loved, that she mattered, that the community had not forgotten her. But Robin did not stop with vigils. She carried her grief into the language of music. At some point in the long months following Summer's disappearance, she wrote a song titled, "Lie These Children at His Feet." The piece was framed as both a tribute to Summer and a broader prayer for missing and endangered children everywhere. The song, tender and solemn, was later paired with video images of Summer herself. Some of these images were previously unseen, small, intimate snapshots that gave the public a glimpse of Summer, not as a headline, but as a little girl in motion, smiling, alive. When the video surfaced online, it triggered an outpouring of emotion. Viewers described being moved to tears. For those who had followed the case from the beginning, the combination of Robin's voice and Summer's face was haunting, almost unbearable. It felt like she was right there again. One commenter wrote. Another said, "Robin gave us a gift. She gave us Summer back for 3 minutes." In the absence of answers from investigators, Robin's song became a kind of substitute for justice, a way to hold on to something meaningful in the chaos. In many ways, it was Robin's finest moment. She had managed to transform grief into art, despair into beauty. To the faithful, her actions were an extension of her spiritual role as a teacher. Just as she had once guided Summer in Sabbath School, she now guided the community toward collective remembrance. And yet, the story did not end there. What to some was an act of pure compassion looked to others like an act of performance. Critics began to notice just how often Robin appeared in interviews, in vigils, in videos, in songs. To them, she was not merely honoring Summer, but inserting herself into the narrative at every possible turn. In online forums, accusations surface. Was Robin trying to help, or was she trying to be seen? The skepticism was amplified by the intensity of her visibility. Many parents, relatives, and teachers grieve quietly in the shadows, avoiding cameras and microphones. Robin seemed to take the opposite route. She became the voice, the song, the memory. For some, that courage was admirable. For others, it was suspicious. If she really cared, one critic wrote online, why is she making sure she is the one in front of the camera every time? The line between love and spotlight blurred, and Robin's image became a mirror, reflecting whatever people wanted to see. To the compassionate, she was an angelic figure keeping Summer's spirit alive. To the cynical, she was a woman who had found in tragedy an opportunity for recognition. The song, the vigils, the interviews, each was evidence, depending on one's perspective, of either devotion or self-promotion. This tension revealed something larger about the psychology of public grief. When a child goes missing, the vacuum left behind is filled not only with questions, but with performances of mourning. Some grieve loudly, others silently. Some turn grief into advocacy, others into retreat. Robin chose music, prayer, and visibility. That choice made her unforgettable, but it also made her vulnerable. Every word, every note, every appearance could be reinterpreted, twisted into something she never intended. Part of what fueled suspicion was the unresolved mystery itself. Had Summer been found safe, Robin's song might have been remembered simply as a hymn of solidarity. Had an arrest been made, her vigils might have been seen as acts of faith that bridged the gap between despair and justice. But because the case remained unsolved, Robin's visibility became a surrogate for missing evidence. With no answers from law enforcement, the community projected its doubts onto those who stood closest to the spotlight. Robin's religious role added another layer of complexity. As a Sabbath school teacher, she was already a figure of moral authority in the eyes of children and parents alike. To some, this gave her song and her public grief a kind of credibility, a sense that she was doing God's work. To others, it made her look like she was cloaking herself in religion to mask ulterior motives. She hides behind the church. One online comment read, "But she's everywhere." To everywhere. The imagery of her song, combined with the images of Summer, only sharpened these divisions. For every tearful supporter who thanked Robin for keeping Summer's name alive, there was a skeptic who called the video manipulative, exploitative, or attention-seeking. This polarization mirrored the broader split in the Summer Wells case itself. A community divided not only over what happened to the little girl, but over who could be trusted to speak for her. What makes Robin's role so fascinating is the way it straddles the line between hope and suspicion. She did not disappear from view like some of the other figures in the case. She remained, consistently and visibly, insisting that Summer mattered, that the community remember her not as a statistic, but as a child. That persistence carved her into the memory of Hawkins County. But the paradox remains: the more she did, the more some people doubted her. In the eyes of the world, she became both the embodiment of hope and the embodiment of suspicion. For some, she was the teacher who turned grief into prayer. For others, she was the woman who sought the spotlight, consciously or unconsciously, in the middle of a tragedy. Ultimately, Robin Lane's song, "Lay These Children at His Feet," may outlive the suspicions around her. Songs have a way of surviving skepticism, of transcending controversy. Long after debates about Robin's motives fade, the image of Summer's smile paired with that melody may remain the single most powerful cultural artifact of the case. It will endure because it embodies both sides of the paradox: love and doubt, devotion and suspicion, memory and mystery. In the end, Robin Lane's role in the Summer Wells story cannot be reduced to either saint or suspect. She is both, depending on who is telling the story. She is the woman who wrote a song that made strangers weep, and she is the woman whose every public act became grounds for suspicion. To this day, she stands at the intersection of hope and mistrust, a reminder that in cases like Summer Wells, the search for truth is never only about facts. It is also about perception, and perception is rarely kind. In the fog of speculation that followed Summer Wells' disappearance, no two figures were scrutinized more relentlessly than her parents, Candus and Dawn. From the very beginning, the public eye judged every word they spoke, every gesture they made. Some saw coldness where others saw shock. Some saw evasion where others saw grief. But amid this sea of contradictory impressions, one observer offered a perspective that carried weight precisely because it came from outside the family circle yet close enough to be intimate. Robin Lane. Robin was not Summer's mother. She was not a blood relative. Yet, as the Sabbath School teacher, who had become a trusted figure in the little girl's life, she found herself entwined with the Wells family in ways she could not have anticipated. Her testimony about Candus and Dawn became a rare window, one not filtered through the parents' own attempts to explain themselves, but through the eyes of someone who had seen them in unguarded moments. She recalled one particular scene with Candus that seemed to contradict the popular narrative of detachment. The criticism of Candus had been harsh and relentless. Commentators on YouTube, Facebook groups, and forums accused her of being emotionless, robotic, uncaring. They pointed to interviews where her tone seemed flat, her face expressionless. To many, this was not the face of a grieving mother. It was the face of someone hiding something. But Robin remembered differently. She recounted a time when Candus was sitting in her vehicle, overwhelmed, the facade of composure shattered. With tears streaming down her face, Candus told her, "I feel like I've lost everything." It was a raw confession, one that stripped away the layers of judgment and left only a woman in anguish. To Robin, this was evidence that Candus was not as cold or detached as the public had painted her. She was simply a mother drowning in sorrow, unable or unwilling to display that vulnerability on camera. Dawn, too, was remembered in Robin's accounts not as a man devoid of emotion, but as someone who carried his pain in his very eyes. She described his expression as "aki," a word that conjured not only sadness but a kind of dull, persistent suffering. It was the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy to put into words. Unlike Candus, Dawn did not sit weeping in front of Robin. His grief, as she described it, was quieter, etched into his gaze rather than his speech. But for Robin, the impression was unmistakable. Here was a father in pain. These details mattered because they came from someone the Wells family had not yet alienated, someone who was not a blood relative, but who had known Summer well enough to understand the stakes. Robin's testimony painted a picture of parents who were not as detached as the headlines suggested, parents who grieved in private ways that cameras could not capture. And yet, these same details introduced a new layer of complexity. For every person who believed Robin's account, there was another who saw it as a kind of defense, a protective instinct that shielded Candus and Dawn from the harshest of accusations. Critics argued that Robin had become too close, too sympathetic, and that her observations could not be taken at face value. Was she reflecting truth, or was she, consciously or unconsciously, serving as their advocate? The timing of her comments fueled suspicion. They often emerged in moments when Candus and Dawn faced public pressure, after a controversial interview, after a wave of online criticism. Robin's recollections of Candus weeping in her vehicle or Dawn's achy eyes seemed to function as counterweights, small stories designed to restore some measure of humanity to two people many had already judged guilty in the court of public opinion. It is possible, of course, that both things are true. That Candus did indeed break down privately, confessing her despair to Robin, that Dawn's eyes did betray a suffering that words could not express, and that Robin, in retelling these moments, was both honest and protective. Trauma does not unfold neatly. People can grieve authentically while others misinterpret them, and outsiders can bear witness while also carrying their own biases. Still, the question lingers: what role did Robin truly play in shaping the narrative around the Wells family? Was she simply recounting what she had seen, offering testimony out of compassion and honesty? Or was she intentionally or not stepping into the role of defender, countering public suspicion with carefully chosen vignettes of grief? The ambiguity is what makes Robin's voice both valuable and controversial. She was not a journalist, trained to report without emotion. She was not a detective, trained to parse evidence without empathy. She was a teacher, a believer, a woman of faith, who had loved a little girl like her own daughter. That love made her voice tender, but it also made it difficult for some to believe she could be objective. For many in the community, Robin's stories of Candus and Dawn became touchstones. They offered glimpses of the Wells family stripped of accusation and defense, revealing moments of vulnerability otherwise hidden from the cameras. But for others, they were red flags too convenient, too polished, too perfectly timed to balance the narrative. In the broader context of the case, Robin's accounts remind us of the difficulty of separating fact from perception in the aftermath of tragedy. Human memory is fragile. Human motives are complex. The truth of what Robin saw may never be fully disentangled from the way she chose to tell it. And until Summer is found, every word will remain suspended in uncertainty, part testimony, part interpretation, part shield. Robin Lane's observations of Candus and Dawn invite us into a paradox. On one hand, they humanize two figures demonized by the public. On the other, they raise uncomfortable questions about loyalty, bias, and the ways in which grief can distort not only those who feel it directly, but those who stand close enough to absorb it secondhand. Did Robin simply describe what was real? Or did she, out of love for Summer and sympathy for her parents, shape the story in a way that protected them from the sharpest edges of suspicion? In that tension lies the power of her role and the enduring mystery of how much of the truth we are truly able to see. In the swirl of rumors that engulfed the Summer Wells case, few details captured public imagination more quickly than the mention of a red pickup truck. In those early hours and days after Summer was reported missing, law enforcement had released an unusual appeal. They were looking for a late 1990s red Toyota pickup, possibly with ladder racks and faded paint. To a public desperate for something tangible, something to cling to, the image of that truck became a beacon. Somewhere out there, people thought, was the driver who might hold the key. It was in this fevered atmosphere that Robin Lane, Summer's Sabbath School teacher, found herself once again in the middle of a conversation larger than she could control. Among the speculation, she spoke with a clarity that stood out. In later interviews and discussions, Robin confirmed that law enforcement had eventually ruled the red truck out as a lead. It was no longer considered a suspect vehicle. On its face, this was a small but important clarification. In a case riddled with uncertainty, every confirmed elimination mattered. And yet, as with so many other things in this case, Robin's words did not land simply as reassurance. They stirred new questions. Why, people asked, was Robin in a position to make such a definitive statement about an active investigation? Why was she, a Sabbath school teacher and not an officer of the law, relaying information about the status of evidence? To those who trusted her, Robin was simply sharing what she had learned, trying to ease confusion and guide the community away from false trails. To others, however, it felt too confident, too authoritative. That moment, Robin acknowledging that the red truck had been ruled out became one of the very few instances where she stepped into the role of informant, rather than mourner or teacher. It was subtle, almost quiet, but it gave her words an unexpected weight. And with that weight came suspicion. The optics of her statement mattered more than the content. In missing persons cases, ordinary community members rarely serve as mouthpieces for investigative updates. That responsibility usually belongs to law enforcement or official spokespeople. By offering even a small detail, Robin blurred the line between grieving community member and unofficial voice of the case. Some thanked her for trying to provide clarity. Others wondered whether she was sharing more than she should have known. Online forums dissected it endlessly. The red truck had been one of the strongest threads of collective hope. Its dismissal and Robin's confirmation of that dismissal left many feeling hollow, as though a possible path toward resolution had been closed off prematurely. For some, Robin's comment seemed to serve as a convenient way to deflate speculation, redirecting attention back onto the Wells family. For others, it was simply a reminder of how confusing and contradictory official updates had been from the start. The paradox was unavoidable. If Robin had stayed silent, she might have been accused of withholding. By speaking up, she risked being accused of knowing too much. Her role was never meant to be that of investigator. Yet the vacuum of trustworthy information created space for voices like hers to carry disproportionate weight. In hindsight, the red truck was just one of many mirages in the case, a lead that caught fire in the public imagination before vanishing into smoke. But Robin's involvement with that detail left a lasting impression. For those inclined to suspicion, it suggested she had access to inside knowledge. For those inclined to empathy, it showed a woman trying to balance the unbearable grief for a missing child she loved and the noise of a community clamoring for answers. What remains significant about this episode is not the red truck itself, but the way Robin's words reshaped perception. A single comment, almost incidental, was enough to reinforce two competing narratives, one of a teacher acting as a bridge between grieving family and the restless public, and one of a woman entangled so deeply in the case that she could no longer be separated from its shadows. As days turned into weeks, the truck faded from official discussion. But the memory of Robin's role in confirming its dismissal lingered. It was another reminder of how, in the absence of resolution, every small statement, every minor clarification, could become magnified. And for Robin Lane, it became yet another line in the complex, often contradictory portrait the public had painted of her. In the search for Summer Wells, some clues led nowhere. Others led only to deeper questions. The red truck belonged to the first category. But the fact that it was Robin Lane, not an investigator, who closed the door on it in the eyes of the community, ensured that suspicion continued to cling to her, just as it had from the very beginning. 3 years have passed since the warm June evening when Summer Wells vanished from her family's home on Ben Hill Road. In that time, countless searches have been conducted, vigils have been held, and speculation has churned endlessly across social media and news reports. Yet, the most painful fact remains unchanged: there is no physical evidence, no confirmed sighting, and no answers. Summer is still missing, suspended in that terrible space where time moves forward, but resolution never arrives. For Robin Lane, the Sabbath School teacher who once received Summer's boundless hugs and whispers of affection, the passage of time has been measured in absence. Every week, when she steps into the classroom where she once taught Summer, she sees a reminder more powerful than any headline or police report: the empty chair. From the very beginning, no child has dared sit there. It remains untouched, like a forbidden zone, a silent monument to a life interrupted. The chair carries a weight of meaning far beyond wood and fabric. To Robin, it is proof of her faith, a placeholder waiting for Summer's return. She has often repeated through tears that she still believes. "I believe she will come home. I have to believe." That conviction has become her anchor, the line she cannot let go of, even as days turn into weeks, weeks into years. For her, hope is not an option, it is a necessity. But outside the walls of her classroom, the community is not so unified. Over time, suspicion has hardened into two distinct camps. One group sees Robin as a grieving witness caught in the undertow of tragedy. They argue that her tears, her songs, her vigils, and her devotion to Summer's memory reflect nothing more than a heartbroken teacher trying to make sense of the senseless. They see her as a symbol of hope in Hawkins County, the one adult who still insists that Summer mattered, that she was loved, and that she deserves to be remembered not as a headline, but as a little girl who once skipped to the front of the church to embrace her teacher. The other camp, however, cannot shake their doubts. They replay her interviews, scrutinize her words, and seize on the smallest inconsistencies. Why didn't she rush to the wells, home immediately after receiving Candus' frantic calls? Why did she describe gathering snacks and flashlights as though preparing for a picnic rather than an emergency? Why did she seem to know more than most when clarifying the status of the red truck? And why, they ask, does she keep placing herself so prominently in the narrative of Summer's disappearance? To these voices, Robin is not simply a mourner. She is a missing piece in a puzzle that has never fit cleanly together. This division reflects a deeper truth about unsolved cases. In the absence of facts, perception becomes reality. People cling to what they can see and hear, magnifying details until they grow into theories. A gesture, a phrase, a pause in an interview, all can become evidence in the court of public opinion. Robin's closeness to Summer, once a source of warmth and security, is precisely what has made her such a lightning rod. To love the child so deeply is to invite the question, what more did she know? And so Robin Lane stands at the heart of a paradox. She is at once a bearer of memory and a target of suspicion. To her students, she is the woman who still keeps Summer's artwork pinned to the classroom board. To her supporters, she is a voice of faith in a community clouded by doubt. To her critics, she is the shadow no one can quite explain, the constant presence that refuses to fade even as years pass without answers. The broader tragedy is that none of these divisions bring Summer back. For all the hours of speculation, for all the vigils and accusations, the mystery remains unsolved. Somewhere out there, the truth exists. Somewhere, the story of what happened to Summer is written in a sequence of events that have yet to be revealed. Until that day comes, Hawkins County remains suspended between faith and fear, between compassion and suspicion. Robin's own words may hold the clearest reflection of that duality. "I have to believe," she has said again and again. To believe is to resist despair, to refuse the finality of loss. But to the skeptical, that same phrase sounds like denial, a refusal to confront darker possibilities. It is a single sentence heard through two very different lenses. And so, 3 years on, the central question lingers, unanswered. Was Robin Lane the light that kept Summer's memory alive? The teacher whose faith refused to die when evidence failed? Or is she something else, entirely a piece of the Hawkins County puzzle, that does not yet fit, a shadow that continues to follow the case wherever it goes? Until Summer Wells is found, the story cannot close. The empty chair will remain untouched. The songs will continue to be sung. The community will remain divided. And Robin Lane will stand at the center of it all, a woman loved by a child, mistrusted by a public, and forever bound to one of the most haunting mysteries in Tennessee's history,